So I'll be talking about several things, but I've organized them into four take-home messages, which are to really understand the basic blood supply of the brain, understand the functional neuroanatomy of important brain regions, understand the functional neuroanatomy of important spinal cord regions as well, and also understand the relationship between neuroanatomy and some common central nervous system diseases. So there are two parts of the nervous system, and that is the central nervous system um, and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is really the brain and the spinal cord, which is an extension of the brain in a column that extends through our vertebral bones down to our lumbar region. Uh, and the central nervous system's response is really responsible for our ability to integrate all the sensory information in our environment, codify them, and utilize them either in our actions, whether they are cognitive actions or physical actions. It's also, there's an automatic component to the nervous system that helps us to respond to threats, to respond to through fight and flight responses. The peripheral nervous system, I'm not really going to talk about, except to say that this is the portion of the nervous system between the spinal cord and all of our organs. So it consists of nerves and ganglia outside of the brain and the spinal cord, and it connects the central nervous system to all our organs, as I mentioned, as well as our limbs. So we're going to talk about some basic neuroanatomy of the brain. So, so the brain is probably the most important organ that human beings have. You know, I sometimes get into arguments with our cardiologists about which organ is more important, but there's no question in my mind that without the brain, there really is no life. And it's the reason why when an individual is brain dead, even though that individual's heart is still beating, and that's really the brain death is when there are absolutely no brain response, but the heart is still beating. In those situations, when an individual is brain dead, you know, in states all across the United States, there are different laws, but essentially that individual is considered dead. And usually we turn off the machine that's sustaining that individual, and that is death. And so the brain is critically important, and without the brain's function, with the absence of brain function, is really incompatible with life and considered death. There are some religious cases where brain death is not recognized, and there are some exceptions in the law for those cases where we keep the machine on, and usually that is an indefinite, that can take years and years, given the amount of support that we have to keep people alive these days until the heart stops beating. So the brain, because it's such an important organ and because it's so precious, there is a very, it's protected by the skull. And the thick skull really protects the brain from damage. But in addition to the skull, the brain has what we call the meninges, 3 meningeal layers over it. The layer immediately covering the brain is called the pia mater. And the layer above the pia mater, it's called the arachnoid matter. And the layer above the arachnoid matter is the dura mater. So these 3 layers are the external coverings of the brain, and the Dura mater is the covering right below the skull. I just also want to point out, as I mentioned, the spinal cord is an extension of the brain. In fact, the lower part of the brain, called the brainstem, is continuous with the spinal cord, and it exits the skull via a hole at the base of the brain called the foramen magnum. And it's through this foramen that the spinal cord exits on its way down to the lumbar region. So there are different ways that we can look at the brain, we can view the brain. There is a sagittal view for the brain, and these are sagittal slices of real pathological specimens. There's a horizontal view of the brain, or the axial view of the brain, and you can see the axial or horizontal slice. And then there's the coronal view of the brain, and you can see the coronal slice. It's important to keep these pictures in mind, because as I show different parts of the brain, I'll be showing coronal sections or sagittal sections or even axial sections of the brain. This is a lateral view, and this here is the sagittal section. And this is just to show you what the brain looks like from a lateral view. You know, this is the medial surface of the brain. This is a sagittal slice. This is the medial surface of the brain. And this is the lateral view of the brain. And this is the front of the brain, the anterior portion of the brain. And this is the back of the brain, the posterior portion of the brain. This is looking at the brain from above. It's called the dorsal view of the brain. Again, this is the anterior, the front of the brain, and this is the back of the brain, the posterior view. And this is looking at the brain from below, and this is what we call the ventral view. Again, anterior section of the brain, and then the posterior parts of the brain. So the brain, as I mentioned, can be divided into the cerebrum, which is where the hemispheres of the brain are, it consists of two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, each of these hemispheres contain 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The stalk that's holding the hemispheres up is called the brainstem. And this brainstem is a very, very critical part of the brain, and it contains a lot of the cranial nerves, which I'll talk about soon. Again, this is continuous with the spinal cord, and this is at the bottom of which exits through the foramen magnum as it becomes the spinal cord. And this structure in blue is called the cerebellum. And this is located at the very back of the brain. And the cerebellum is very important, as we will talk about in coordination. So the brain, both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, are distinguished by 2 distinct regions, so called the white matter and the gray matter. And if you look at this coronal section of the brain, you can see this dark brown area that you can see that lines the brain. This dark brown ribbon. You can see this is what we call the gray matter, and this is composed of all the cell bodies, and it's very, very important because this is where a lot of those cell bodies are. And then you have the white matter. And the white matter is this more yellowish, lighter section, this contains a lot of the axons, the myelinated fibers or unmyelinated fibers. These nerve fibers or axons all occupy the white matter of the brain, and this figure really shows the cell body, and you can see the axon, and then covering the axon are these sheaths, the sheath called myelin, And this myelin sheath is very important in conduction, and helping getting messages to and fro with very, very rapid speed. Myelinated fibers are very fast conducting fibers. So if you want to get information very rapidly from one brain cell to another, the myelinated axons are the fast way to do that. And you can see here the axon surrounded by the myelin sheath. And so the white matter of the spinal cord, similarly to the white matter of the cerebrum, also contains these axons. And this is the gray matter of the spinal cord, which contains, again, the cell bodies. So this is a lateral view of the brain, and this really just shows all the different areas of the brain. I talked about the different lobes, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. But within those lobes, the regions can be further subdivided into very important areas. This pink area is called the premotor cortex, and this structure here is called the supplementary motor cortex. Um, this, this structure here in green is the somatosensory cortex, and right in front of it is the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is the most posterior part of the frontal lobe, and the somatosensory cortex is the most anterior part of the parietal lobe. And then you have the visual cortex, which is the occipital cortex. And then you have the temporal lobe, which contains the auditory cortex, which contains, there's a gyrus here called Heschel's gyrus that is responsible for our hearing. And then this particular figure over here really just shows you all the different functions of the regions that I just mentioned. So the occipital cortex at the back is responsible for vision. The temporal lobe, the superior temporal gyrus of the temporal lobe, and a little bit of the parietal lobe is involved in language comprehension. The sensory cortex, so I mentioned the somatosensory cortex, which is this purple strip here, is responsible for sensations, pain, temperature, touch, and vibration. The motor cortex, which is this yellow part, is really responsible for our strength and our movement. That's the motor function. And right in front of it, where the supplementary motor area is, that's involved in the planning of our movements and the execution of our movements. And then there's some other parts of the frontal lobe that are involved in judgment, our ability judgment, and then further down in the inferior part of the frontal lobe is an area that's responsible for language production. So our ability to express language is represented in this inferior frontal part, and our ability to understand language is responsible. The responsibility is the parietal and the temporal lobes. And so you could imagine if the damages, if any of these areas are damaged, the function that they're responsible for is what is lost. So visual cortex damage can impair your vision. Sensory cortex damage can impair your sensation. Motor cortex damage can impair your ability to move. Language cortex damage could impair your ability to produce speech or to understand speech. And then the cerebellum, which I mentioned earlier, this is our coordination center. And so if you have a problem in the cerebellum, you might have inability to, your movements might become very uncoordinated. And then there are some larger functions of the left and the right hemisphere, depending on if you're right-handed or left-handed. So language is one that we always talk about. Language is typically located in the left hemisphere. And that is for in 99% of people who are right-handed, language is in the left hemisphere. In 1%, it's in the right, but for the most part, language in right-handed individuals is located in the left hemisphere, in those areas that I mentioned before. Um, the right hemisphere is very important for spatial orientation. So your ability to be oriented in space and to be able to ability to recognize the space is located in the right hemisphere. There are other skills, or other functions that the right and the left hemisphere are involved in, but the important ones are really spatial orientation as well as language. If you are left-hander, if you're left-handed, then 60% of the time your language is in the left hemisphere still. 20% of the time in a left-hander, your language is co-dominant. It's both in the left and the right, so it's represented across both hemispheres, and 20% of the time it's represented in your right hemisphere. That is if you are a left-hander versus a right-handed individual where 99% is in the left hemisphere. So this is just to go over some of these important areas again. Remember, the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe in the most posterior aspect, and the sensory cortex is in the most anterior aspect of the parietal lobe. This is the precentral gyrus, the motor cortex, and the sensory cortex is the postcentral gyrus. These are very important to our ability to feel and our ability to move. So these are very important areas when damaged. I mentioned the speech production centers. That is called Broca's area in the inferior frontal lobe. And I talked about your comprehension, ability to comprehend speech, which is called Wernicke's area, which is in the parietal regions and the superior temporal regions. And then I've talked about the visual cortex and the occipital lobe. Now, this is a functional MRI. This is a real life functional MRI of the brain that shows how the brain reacts in response to instructions. And so in this first figure A, is when the individual is told to look at words. And what happens here is remember, this is a lateral view, and this is the posterior part of the brain. And this red area is the area that's lighting up on that functional imaging. So looking at words, the occipital lobe, which is involved in vision, lights up. When you're told to listen to words, the individual is told to listen to words. And what happens is you're listening, you're trying to understand or comprehend the speech that you're hearing. And in that situation, the speech comprehension regions that I mentioned, the Wernicke's areas, that lights up when you're asked to listen to words as the individual is trying to understand or comprehend what he's listening to. When you tell that individual to speak words, to produce language, that the inferior frontal, the frontal lobe, the inferior part of the frontal lobe, that area you can see lighting up. This is a real brain of the individual being told to speak words. And this is an area that's lighting up. When you tell the individual to think about words, what happens is not only does the comprehension area light up, these areas light up, and the production areas also light up, but the areas involved in planning and execution, as well as some of your prefrontal cortex also lights up as these regions in the brain are being activated as you are thinking about words. So to talk a little bit more about the motor and sensory systems. So I mentioned the motor cortex, and I showed you where the motor cortex was located. So these are where all the cell bodies, they're called pyramidal cells. This is where these pyramidal cells, these motor cell bodies are located in the precentral gyrus, which is the motor cortex. And from these cell bodies, the axons are sent and they travel all the way down through the brainstem. This is the cerebral hemisphere. This is the upper part of the brainstem. This is the middle part of the brainstem. This is the lower part of the brainstem. And you can see these axons coming down from the motor cortex. We call them pyramidal tracts from the pyramidal cells in the motor cortex. They're traveling down all the way through the brainstem until they reach the spinal cord. And when they get to the spinal cord, they synapse at the spinal cord. And then there's some interneurons that connect those pyramidal fibers within the gray matter of the spinal cord. And those exit as part of the peripheral nervous system. And then they go to the hand or the area that we're trying to move or operate. And recognize here that the pyramidal fibers, they actually cross over in the medulla, which is the lowest part of the brainstem, is where they cross over from the left side to the right side, or it could be from the right side to the left side. So these motor fibers start on one side of the brain, they cross over in the lower part of the brain, and then they go to the other side. And so if you have injury to the right motor cortex, you are going to basically affect the left side of the body that's represented. And likewise, if you have injury to the left motor cortex, you are going to affect the right side of the body. And that's because of where they cross in the lower part of the brainstem from one side to the other. The sensory cortex, remember I mentioned the somatosensory cortex, which is the postcentral gyrus. They also contain all the cell bodies. And in this situation, information, if you, let's say your finger is pricked by a pin or a needle, that sensory information travels from your finger to the spinal cord. They travel up the dorsal, a structure called the dorsal columns in the spinal cord. They travel upwards, or via the spinothalamic tracts. These are sensory pathways that carry the perception of pain. They're trying to carry them to the sensory cortex where they can be analyzed, but they travel up, these sensory pathways travel up either via the spinothalamics or the dorsal columns, depending on the type of sensory stimulus. If it's pain, it's going to travel up the spinothalamic tracts, these sensory tracts, and that crosses over to the opposite side within the spinal cord and then travels up the brainstem all the way into the cerebral hemispheres to the sensory cortex. So again, if there's a lesion of the sensory cortex, you might not be able to feel something on the opposite side of the body. The motor both the motor cortex and the sensory cortex are arranged in a special way, this has been described by what we call the homunculus. So the homunculus really is a representation of how the body is spaced out or represented either in the sensory cortex or in the motor cortex. In the case of the motor cortex, the tongue and the face and all the muscles and the representation of the face are represented on the lateral convexity of the brain versus the leg area, which is represented more medially in the brain, and you can see the hand area between that. And because of all the fine motor movements that our fingers make, and because of how our hands are so important for survival, you can see how there's a large representation of the hand. And because our faces and our mouths and our tongues are so important for survival, taste and eating and speaking, etc., and all those muscles are so intricate, you can see the large representation of the face, the large representation of our hands versus the smaller representation of the leg and the trunk. And this is the same for the sensory cortex. You know, we do a lot with our hands, You can see the large representation of the hands, and then you can see a large representation of the face. So the homunculus really just describes the way that the parts of the body are represented either in the sensory cortex or the motor cortex. And so if the motor fibers are traveling from the motor cortex, they're coming in from the facial structures, from the hand structures, from the leg structures. You can see that these structures start out at different parts of the motor cortex, either more medially on the motor cortex or more laterally on the motor cortex. But as they travel down towards the spinal cord, they bunch together. They become very closely knit, because you imagine the spinal cord and the brainstem are very small structures, that stalk-like structure relative to the larger structure of the brain. So they bunch together on their way down as they travel down into the spinal cord. And so if you have an injury in the spinal cord, because they're all bunched together, it can be quite devastating, and you can lose, one half of your body. Versus if you have an injury just in this part where the face is represented, it might only be your face that's affected. If you have an injury where just the hand is represented, you might just have your hand affected. Or if you have an injury where your leg is represented, it might just only be your leg that's affected. But if you have a massive injury to the brain across that whole structure, then that whole area will be represented, will be affected. The cranial nerves are also very, very important structures in the brain, and these are located in the brainstem, the stalk that I mentioned, this area called the brainstem that holds up the cerebral hemispheres. And there are 12 cranial nerves, and they're very, very important for a lot of what human beings do. The olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, is important for smell. The optic nerve is involved in vision. The oculomotor nerve is involved in eye movements. The trigeminal nerve is involved in facial sensation, as well as vibration, and also some motor movements of the jaw. The trochlear nerve is involved in eye movements. The abducens is also involved in eye movements. The facial nerve is involved in the facial strength. Vestibular ocular nerve, that's involved in balance and our ability to maintain our balance, but also it's also involved in our ability to hear. So this is the auditory nerve. So it's got a combination of the vestibular system, which is the balance system, and the cochlear system, which is our auditory, our ability to hear system. So this 8th cranial nerve is very involved in our ability to hear, but can also influence balance. The 9th cranial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, that's important for swallowing and the muscles at the back of our mouths and our palates. The vagus nerve is also a very important component of swallowing, and it has a branch that when involved can affect the hoarseness of our voice, so it's involved in our voice box as well. And then the hypoglossal nerve, that is involved in our tongue movement, the movement of our tongue. And the accessory nerve is it's a muscle that's responsible for, which is actually the neck, a neck muscle, the accessory nerve that's involved in the ability to turn our heads. So how does this brain, we've talked about all these incredible functions of the brain. We've talked about where they're located. How do these functions, how are they sustained? How are they fed, and what type of nutrients do they need to continue to function optimally? And so oxygen is the key ingredient for human beings, and that is the brain also. The brain actually consumes 20% of the oxygen in our blood. So even though the brain is just 2% of our body mass, it takes 1/5 of all the oxygen in our bloodstream. That's how important the brain is. That's why it's called a vital organ. It consumes so much of the oxygen that we we take into our blood. And then through a network of very impressive arteries that branch throughout the brain and supply oxygen to every area of the brain, that's how the oxygen reaches the brain through this complex network of arteries. And these blood vessels, as you know, are oxygenated in the lungs, and they're pumped to the brain from the heart across the body. But so if the brain cells are deprived of oxygen, you can imagine they don't last very long before they start dying. Within minutes of oxygen deprivation, these brain cells actually start to die. This is just to show the complex branching of these arteries and some of the cranial nerves that have relationships with the arteries anatomically. It's also to show that the brain, there's a structure called the circle of Willis, which is a very, very impressive, almost roundabout in the brain that really allows the brain to kind of shift the direction of the blood. And so if one area is blocked through this roundabout system, the arteries from another area can bring blood to that area. And so this roundabout system of the brain that's receiving all these major arteries allow the brain to compensate if one area is blocked, and then through this roundabout system, the blood can still get there by taking another route. It's called the circle of Willis. And this is just a lateral view of the brain, and these are two very important arteries, the internal carotid arteries that travel up the neck, and they branch to supply oxygen to a lot of the cerebral hemispheres. And this is a coronal view to show the branching of the internal carotid artery into two major branches. One is called the middle cerebral artery, and the other is called the anterior cerebral artery. And these are branches of the internal carotid, and they bring oxygen to the brain, especially the hemispheres. This is just to show that the homunculus, the representation that I described over the motor cortex, actually have different blood supply. The anterior cerebral artery that I showed you, the branch of the internal carotid artery, supplies the leg area, the foot area, versus the hand and the face that's supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So these different areas have different blood supply. And that's the way it is with the brain. The brain, the blood supply to the brain comes from different branches of either the anterior cerebral artery or the middle cerebral artery in this case, but also at the back of the brain, there are branches of the posterior cerebral artery. And all these branches supply different parts of the brain. The brain also, once the oxygen is removed from the arteries, that deoxygenated blood is cycled back to the lungs via a network of veins in the brain that drain the deoxygenated blood and carry them all the way back for reoxygenation. There is also other structures in the brain that are called ventricles, the ventricular system. They're the lateral ventricular system, which really spans across the cerebral hemispheres. There's a third ventricle, which really connects the lateral ventricles to certain foramen and aqueducts that connect to the fourth ventricles. And this ventricular system contains what we call special fluid called cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain, the entire brain, and it's responsible for cleansing the brain and kind of cleaning out the brain. And the next slide shows how it's made in an area called the choroid plexus, and how this fluid just bathes the entire brain. You can see this blue, all this blue color is the fluid as it's traveling all around the brain and bathing the brain and cleansing the brain, and also providing nutrients to the brain and removing toxins from the brain. And so these network of ventricles are very, very important to the brain. And they also bathe the spinal cord. Remember, you can see that this is the lower brain or the brainstem, which is continuous with the spinal cord. And you can see also the cerebrospinal fluid also bathes the entire spinal cord. So let's talk about the anatomy of some common brain diseases. So first of all, I just want to mention that your lifestyle, the lifestyle we lead, can cause a lot of different types of brain diseases, especially those that are mediated by the arteries. Now, the arteries, as I mentioned, they should be nice and clean, nice and open, nice and clean arteries, and this is a nice clean artery. And the healthy person who lives a healthy lifestyle, doesn't smoke, doesn't eat high cholesterol foods, has a healthy diet, exercises, all of these things maintain a healthy artery. When these unhealthy habits creep into your life, or an individual starts smoking or eating unhealthy foods, you start getting what we call atherosclerotic plaque buildup on the arterial wall. And the more of this unhealthy lifestyle that the individual continues, the thicker this plaque buildup on the arterial wall, this junk that's building up, this plaque, which is just all the gunk and junk that's building up in the arterial wall, it makes the arteries stiffer and stickier. And when the arteries become stickier, clots can form in the arteries. And when the arteries become stiffer, they're less compliant, and the pressure builds up inside them. And that's how high blood pressure can develop as a result of this arterial stiffening. And when that occurs over time and the artery is finally blocked by this clot, what can happen is you get no oxygen traveling up that blocked artery, and the area beyond that blockage starts to die off, and the neurons start to die off. And so it's very, very important for us to live a healthy lifestyle to keep the artery nice and healthy and nice and clean. And so, as I mentioned, when that artery is blocked and you have lack of oxygen to the brain, this is what we call brain anoxia. You can see when you have brain anoxia, the area that artery supplies doesn't function. So those symptoms, let's say the artery supplying the speech production area is affected, Broca's area where we produce speech is affected. If the artery going there is affected, then you can't produce speech. If depending on which artery is involved, you can have very discrete symptoms, neurological symptoms, depending on the function of that area. If a large artery like the internal carotid is affected, then almost the whole hemisphere can be starved of oxygen, and you can see just massive cell death and necrosis or dying and death of the brain as a result of this brain anoxia. And ultimately, the brain starts looking shriveled up as all those brain cells and axons are all dead from the brain anoxia. And so this is what a stroke is. A stroke really is blockage of a brain cell that's responsible, blockage of an artery that causes failure of oxygen to an area, part of the brain that causes tissue perfusion failure or a tissue anoxia. And that's really what a stroke is. And the reason why some people have very different symptoms of stroke, whether it's weakness of the arm or the leg or difficulty speaking, is because those areas, the function of those areas are impaired by that blocked artery that supplies it. And so if you do have a blockage of an artery, and you do have cell death of that brain region or axonal death of that brain region, the longer that artery is blocked, the more brain cells we lose. In fact, every minute that the artery is blocked, we lose about 1.9 million brain cells. And so just imagine how many brain cells are lost within 30 minutes of a stroke being left untreated. The good news is that we can actually treat strokes, and I'll show you in my next slide. But this is just to emphasize that depending on the region of the brain, the motor cortex, the sensory cortex, the supplementary motor cortex, the visual cortex, the Broca's area, or the Wernicke's area, or the language comprehension cortex, or Broca's area, or the language production areas. If any of these areas are affected selectively by a blood vessel, then those functions will be affected. If the coordination center, which is the cerebellum, is affected, then that individual will become incoordinated. So when you have a sudden blockage of an arterial branch to any of these areas, that will manifest as stroke symptoms. So stroke symptoms can include speech dysfunction, producing speech. Stroke symptoms can include language dysfunction, comprehending speech. You can have slurring of your speech because the mechanical muscles responsible for speech are affected. Or you can have motor dysfunction of one half of your body. And I told you how the left motor cortex affects the right side of the body. The visual cortex also can be affected if the arterial branch supplying it is affected. The coordination, the cerebellum, if that's affected, you can lose coordination in your body. And obviously, if you have a stroke, all the inflammation that takes place when you're having a stroke, and all the chemicals that are spilled from the dying cell can trigger pain receptors and cause a severe headache as well. Again, this is just to emphasize that a stroke on one side will affect the body on an opposite side. So a right-sided stroke will cause the left side of the body, and the left side of the stroke will cause the right side of the body. And this is just showing why that happens, is because of the crossing over of those fibers at the base of the brain in the area of the lower brainstem to the other side. It's why one half of the brain affects the other half of the body. Again, just to show that even after a stroke occurs and that 1 minute continues and you're losing 1.9 million brain cells, we can treat it. And we treat it with a medication called clot-busting medication. And that medication basically dissolves the clot and restores blood flow. And so the quicker we get this medication in the patient's system, the more brain cells we can save. The difference of 15 minutes can really affect millions and millions of brain cells. That increases your risk of death and decreases your recovery. And so this is why we say time is brain. This is why we want people to treat these stroke symptoms as a medical emergency and call 911. Because if you don't treat them as a medical emergency, or you try to sleep on your symptoms, think they're going to go away, you try to take public transportation or a slower way to the hospital. If you do all of these things, then what could happen is that you're losing millions and millions of brain cells every minute, which is why it's critically important to call 911. In addition to the clot-busting medication, we can also mechanically extract the clot from the body using a catheter that we insert in the artery through the groin. And you can see this catheter, special catheter, and it grips hold of the clot and it pulls out the clot. This is a patient of mine, and this is a pretty large blood clot that was pulled from his brain. So just to talk about the spinal cord, and so the spinal cord I mentioned is an extension of the brain, and it typically ends in what we call the lumbar region. And so the vertebrae The vertebrae of the brain are divided into four parts: the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, and the sacral vertebrae. And the spinal cord courses through all of these areas, and depending on the area that's damaged, if the cervical area is damaged, you affect not only the arms, which exit the spinal cord in the cervical area, and the legs if you have a transection there, versus if you have a transection lower down in the thoracic area, where you spare the arms because they've already come out of the cervical area, and then you have a paraplegic type of syndrome. And so depending on where the spinal cord is injured, the nerve fibers and axons going to the arms come out in the cervical areas, and the nerve fibers going to the trunk come out in the thoracic area, and a lot of the leg also come out in the lower thoracic and lumbar region. So if you have a transection in the thoracic area, you're paralyzed from the waist down, and you spare the arms because those axons and fibers exit the spinal cord higher up in the cervical cord. Like I mentioned earlier, the spinal cord also has gray and white matter, and the gray matter is responsible for housing the cells that are involved in our strength, in our movement, and our motor strength, versus this occurs in the area called the anterior horn cell, in the ventral root of the gray the gray horn in the middle of the spinal cord, versus the white matter of the spinal cord, which houses a lot of those axons that are traveling down from the brain, like those traveling down from the motor cortex, which is the central nervous system component, which connects into the gray matter in the ventral horns before they exit the spinal cord and supply, whether it's the arms in the cervical cord or the legs lower down, or the thoracic regions in the middle of the cord. And the same applies for the sensory system. They come in via the sensory nerves into the more dorsal gray matter before traveling up in the white matter as tracks on their way to the sensory cortex. And so the spinal cord also has a gray matter and a white matter. And this is just to show the white matter of the spinal cord and the gray matter of the spinal cord, which is more central. And again, the ventral horn houses a lot of the motor cells that are responsible for traveling to our arms and our legs to move them. And the dorsal horns is where all the sensory inputs enter through. Everything travels up through the white matter tracts on the way up to the brain, or they descend in white matter tracts down into the white matter before they synapse in the gray matter with the cell bodies of those anterior motor horn cells. And just to show that there are diseases that can occur in the spinal cord, very important disease. I've talked about transection of the spinal cord, where you have a total spinal cord injury, and how you can be quadriplegic if it's high up in the cervical cord, or paraplegic if it's lower down. But there are other diseases of the selective for the white matter of the spinal cord, and this is a multiple sclerosis is a disease of the white matter of the central nervous system, and it could be the white matter of the spinal cord as it's shown here, or it could be the white matter of the brain. I mentioned that there's also white matter in the brain, and multiple sclerosis is a disease of the white matter, either in the spinal cord or in the brain. And it can cause a lot of symptoms depending on what the white matter tracks, what type of functions that they're responsible for carrying. There are also diseases of the gray matter, the ventral gray matter of the spinal cord. And one famous disease is what we call Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, or motor neuron disease. And that's the disease where the muscles just get progressively weaker. And that's a disease that occurs from the anterior horn cells, or the motor cells within the gray matter of the spinal cord, versus a white matter disease is like multiple sclerosis, which also can occur in the spinal cord, as well as the white matter in the brain. Multiple sclerosis is a white matter disease, and what it does is that it's a disease of myelin. And so remember I mentioned that the myelin is this almost fatty type of layer that covers the axons. And when the myelin is diseased, as in multiple sclerosis, the axon is exposed, and the myelin is damaged. And if multiple sclerosis continues left unchecked, then not only the myelin gets affected, but then you have what we call secondary axonal loss, and then the axon also becomes diseased over time. But it really begins with damage to the myelin covering of the brain. And when you have damage to the myelin, as I mentioned, the myelin is important in the brain's ability to conduct information in a very fast and speedy way. And so if you're damaged to the myelin, then the conduction is impaired, and the brain can no longer conduct these important impulses efficiently. And that failure of conduction is manifested as symptoms of multiple sclerosis. And if the myelin disease progresses, you can have axonal damage. And depending on where the injury of the myelin takes place, whether it's a particular area in the white matter of the spinal cord or a particular area in the white matter of the brain, the functions that those axons are carrying are affected. And that is the manifestation that we see in the actual patient. And I'm going to stop there so to give some time for some questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your lecture. Listening, feel free to just raise your hands in Zoom and we can call on you to ask. I think Raul is the first person to have a question.
Yeah, so my question is, can you explain the physiotopic organization of the visual cortex and the functional components that designate those V1 to V6 neurons, their different layering in the brain?
Well, that's a very important question, because the way the visual cortex is arranged is as you mentioned, really determines some of the functions of the brain. But before that, I just want to walk you through the visual cortex, the visual system, so everyone really understands the visual system as a baseline. So the visual system, so light comes into the eye, and when the light comes into the eye, it travels to the back of the eye, to all those retinal layers, the bipolar cells and all those different retinal areas. And then that impulse travels down the optic nerve, and it travels from the optic nerve to the prechiasmatic area. And from the prechiasmatic part of the optic nerve, those visual fibers travel south down towards an area called the pretectal area, which is in the upper part of the midbrain. When the fibers reaches the pretectal area of the midbrain, what happens there is that they cross over to the opposite side across. So I'm going to go back. So when it travels back to the chiasm, then it continues as what we call the optic radiations. I'm going to come back to the pretectal area when I talk about the oculomotor nerve. But it travels back as optic radiations, and those optic radiations travel either superiorly, they're fanned out, and they travel superiorly in the parietal lobe, or inferiorly in the temporal lobe. And what happens is when they travel either as optic radiation superiorly or inferiorly, they get to a gyrus called the calcarine gyrus. And the calcarine cortex is really where the visual information is processed. And so the primary visual cortex is what we call, that's the area that we call V1.
Oh, okay.
And this primary visual cortex is actually one of the most important areas and most studied areas in the brain. It's very simple. It's the simplest part of the cortex, and it's very specialized in kind of discerning static and moving objects. And it's quite actually heavily represented in some primates and lower mammals. Um, and then so that's the V1 area, and V1 actually is where the first stage of visual processing in the cortex takes place. And in primates, it actually creates what we call a saliency map from these visual inputs that guides our ability to shift attention, which is known it's actually known as these gaze shifts. And so that's probably the most important visual area, V1. Now, V2 is the secondary visual cortex. It's also called the pre-striate cortex. And this is one of the areas that's the first area of what area we call the visual association area. And it has very important connections that feed both forwards and backwards. And sometimes when you have involvement of these visual association areas, if any of you have read Oliver Sacks, and when he talks about palinopsia and prosopagnosia, and palinopsia is when you have these recurrent flashing images, and sometimes you get this palinopsia where these images, these after images occur when the visual association part of V2 is affected. So V2 is very important as well. And the V3, this is the third area, and this is the third visual complex. And it's actually also a very important area because it has some important connections with other parts of the brain. And it's important in responding to a whole variety of visual stimuli, including some of the areas responsible for color. And it's subdivided into V3A and V3B, but I don't want to really go into too much detail about V3. And then you have V4, which is another important, and this is an extrastriate visual cortex. It's actually a very, very important visual cortex, V4, because it not only does it receive direct input from V1, but it also projects to areas of V5, which is a special area called the dorsal prelunar gyrus. And the V4 is very important because it's really involved in your ability to kind of tune in towards complex objects, right? You know, going back to Oliver Sacks talked about inability to recognize faces, right? He's written a lot about inability to recognize familiar faces, and that is what we see when we have V4 lesions. You're unable to really understand these complex objects such as faces, especially when they involve the most inferior temporal part of the cortex. So, and then V5 is just the middle temporal visual cortex visual area, and that's involved in sometimes the perception of motion, and then you have V6, which is another area which is more dorsomedial, and that's also involved in kind of that has connections both anterior and posteriorly. It's a highly myelinated area, and it's involved in kind of converging a lot of the parts of the visual field, and it has some selectivity for motion within visual patterns. And so that's really a little bit about the different visual areas, cortices in the visual system. And going back to the visual cortex, I mentioned before you get to the optic radiations, as those impulses, as the impulses get to the prechiasmatic area, there's they drop down to the pretectal area, and then and this is really involved in, you know, when you shine light on the eye, you know, you get the pupil constricts. And the reason why the pupil constricts is because those afferent travel back to the pretectal area, prechiasmatically, dropping down to the midbrain, going across a structure called the posterior commissure, and then they synapse with a nucleus called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and they return with the third nerve, cranial nerve 3, and they travel all the way back, cranial nerve 3, all the way back to actually it's right at the supraorbital fissure where they split, and then they're responsible for the constriction of the pupil. So that the visual pathway is the vision itself going back to the occipital cortex, but there's also when you shine light in the eye and you get pupillary constriction, that is another part of the visual system that involves what we call the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that detailed explanation. I think for the students, we're actually going to be talking a little bit more about some of the sensory systems and then the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system in future lectures. So if this sounds interesting to you, just we'll hear a lot more about that soon. It looks like our next question is Liliana.
Thank you. So my question is about language acquisition and how when neuroscientists are looking at patients who are maybe unilingual and multilingual, how maybe the language production centers differ between the two. If you can touch on that a little bit.
So what was the question again? Language acquisition?
Yes, and how maybe the centers of different parts of the brain differ between people who are multilingual and people who only know one language.
That's a great question, actually, because it's very interesting, because I'm going to answer this in reverse, because just as an example, when an individual has injury from a stroke, when an injury has injury with a stroke, sometimes what you find is the
lesson.
Sorry, can you mute the phone, please?
Okay.
Can you mute the phone? Sometimes what you find that when an individual has a stroke is that you have sometimes the language that's best preserved is the primary language, and the language that's lost is the acquired language. So we often see a phenomenon whereby an individual cannot comprehend or cannot speak in his acquired language, and yet that individual is able to communicate and speak in the primary language, and that's because the primary, language acquisition, the first language that a child learns, and the first language that a child acquires is very, very robust and really woven into a lot of those cells and neurons and pathways and networks involved in language, and so those structures you find are very, very resilient, and what happens is that because they're so resilient in the way that they were, because of how they were acquired at the early stage during as a child is developing, as a baby is developing, acquiring that first language, that those networks are very, very robust and very, very resistant to ischemic injury relative to language that's typically acquired later, second languages. Now, the reason why these networks are more robust it requires a much more time to explain, but it's really related to the nature in which you acquire that primary language during your developmental years as you're acquiring language as a child during those very early years. Remember that there are many things that are still occurring in the brain. You know, the brain is still myelinating at that time. And the complexity is, the neurons are still, neuronal pathways and networks are still developing at that time. And so as you're acquiring language simultaneously with this process of neuronal development and neuronal complexity, that language actually becomes very, very hardwired in the system, and relative to acquired language is much more resistant to things like ischemia. The actual, embryological, histological explanations are a little bit more complex, but I just want to give you just a brief overview about why primary languages tend to be a lot more robust, a lot more resistant to injury relative to acquired language. And it's all really related to the way it's developed during those very sensitive developmental periods of a child.
Thank you.
Okay, and it looks like our next question is from Jasmine.
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. I just was curious to know whether it would ever be a situation in which gray and white matter would be combined, and if so, what would the result of that be?
So if there's ever a situation where gray and white matter is combined, that's an excellent question. And there are situations that sometimes that happens. We call it cortical. We see it in situations that we call cortical dysplasia. In cortical dysplasia, sometimes what happens is that you find these these abnormal areas typically occurs before a child is born, and then what happens is that when the developing brain cells or the neurons they fail to reach the part of the brain that they're genetically destined, and so what happens is they don't quite get to where they're supposed to be, and so you get this cortical area within an area that's really supposed to be a white matter area, and as a result, these areas of cortical dysplasia, where you have the brain lacks the appropriate neural connections to function properly, and it's actually, now that you ask, it's a very, very common cause of epilepsy that we see, especially in children, where we have this cortical dysplasia. And sometimes we have to actually surgically go into the brain and remove surgically the area of cortical dysplasia in order to stop the seizures.
Thank you.
Looks like our next question is Dana.
Hey there, Professor. How are you?
I'm very well.
I was wondering if you have any insights into how childhood trauma can affect the development of the structural brain.
Sure.
Really anywhere.
That's an excellent question, because it's a very important topic of today. The whole area of adverse childhood experiences and the brain. Now, we now know that adverse childhood experiences, what we call toxic stress or trauma to the brain, can actually cause atrophy of certain areas, particularly the prefrontal cortex, an area called the amygdala, the hippocampus, an area called the hippocampus, and also Sometimes areas of the parietal lobe can be affected. Um, and and the reason why is that, imagine, just imagine having repeated stress. What happens when the body is under repeated trauma or repeated trauma? And before I'll talk about it, I just want to say that the brain continues to develop, continues to wire in girls up until age 22, and in boys up until about age 24. But we are born with about 100 billion brain cells, and that stays the same. The difference is that at birth, that these cells are not fully wired. And so the wiring of the different brain regions is really what's responsible for the developmental milestones. And so going back to your question about trauma, when you have a traumatic event or this acute stressful event, what happens is that there's activation of your limbic system, which is primarily and you're going to hear about it in a lecture coming up. But this is the system involved in the flight, fight, or freeze stress response, and it's mainly located in a part of the brain called the amygdala. And so this fight, flight, or freeze response is activated when you experience this trauma. And so what happens is that, we know that from an evolutionary perspective, the stress response is a key to survival. It's a key to human adaptation, our ability to survive in the wild. A threat from a lion or a threat from a tiger, or just our ability to fight and survive and thrive has really been built around this flight, fight, or freeze stress response, or this stress response. And so, unfortunately, you can trigger the stress response, especially today. You don't only need physical danger to trigger the stress response. You can trigger the stress response through thoughts and through emotions and even through bad memories. And so, imagine having chronic activation of a stress response through trauma, chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system through trauma. And imagine this occurring during a period where the brain is still wiring, where the wiring of the limbic system is still happening. And so what happens is that, the wiring of the sympathetic functions, the fight flight system becomes abnormal relative to the deactivation of that system. And so what happens is that, remember that the sympathetic system shuts down. Well, you're going to hear this later. It shuts down your digestive system in order to conserve glucose that's required to fight or to flee. There are changes in eating habits. Stress eating, which is to build up carb-rich foods that you require to fight or flee. And then, imagine. And then you're awake, you're alert because of the danger, so you don't sleep because of the system is activated. Your blood pressure is heightened because there's some vasoactive activity that causes your blood pressure to go up in response to getting ready to fight or flee. And so all of this activation, this overactivation of this system during the period of the brain as it's developing, right, causes certain parts of the brain to underdevelop relative to other parts of the brain. And so what you typically happen is that the temporal lobe, where a lot of the limbic system is, that part of the brain can become atrophic and become smaller in volume and size. The prefrontal cortex, which is really the areas responsible for our decision-making, executive, judgment, that is overrun by our fight and flee centers. And so that area is underdeveloped. And the hippocampal areas are also underdeveloped. So as a result of trauma that a child experiences, or anyone experiences up until the ages of 23, 22 for girls and 24 for boys, as long as the brain is still wiring, if you experience trauma during that period, it can affect the development of these key brain areas. And that's why some folks can end up with severe anxiety syndromes, emotional dysregulation syndromes, even behavioral syndromes, because of this chronic overactivation that's caused by trauma. And the way that the brain is developing is altered and is shifted towards development of one particular area over another particular area. And so what we see in the brains of traumatized children who've sustained trauma for many, many years is we see a smaller amygdala, a smaller prefrontal cortex, and a lot of the limbic structures are also smaller. But the good news is that, and that's why we all talk about disparities and health disparities and racism and discrimination. And you can imagine all these young individuals who are experiencing all this trauma, what is happening to their brain development. The good news is because the brain is what we call neuroplastic. It's very malleable and it's very neuroplastic. Its ability to kind of like mold and mend itself through this plasticity. Because of that, the brain can actually bounce back from a lot of this. And the way that happens is through nurturing. So if this same individual's just been traumatized when they're young during brain development, if that same individual starts getting love and kindness and nurturing, the brain can actually recover from all those traumatic effects through neuroplasticity, and those brain areas that have shrunken or have underdeveloped can catch up and grow back to their normal sizes. And so that's why the trauma actually can, as you correctly pointed out in your question, can really affect brain development.
Thank you very much.
And it looks like our next question will be from Keziah.
Yes. Hello. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous. Thank you for today's lecture. My question is, would you recommend any reading material of what you have discussed previously? And I'm quite interested in the effects of trauma myself because I suffer with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I would like to develop my understanding of what processes are happening. And you mentioned briefly about the neuroplasticity and sorry for the whole question.
Sure. And so, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, there are a lot of emerging literature, and all you need to do is really search for, search for the literature around, that talks, these are some keywords. The keywords are adverse childhood experiences and brain development. Another keywords are toxic stress and brain development. And another keyword is allostatic load, ALLOSTATIC, allostatic load and brain development. Those three areas will really show you how these types of issues that you're interested in affects brain development.
Thank you very much.
And next, it looks like we have a question from Leo.
Howdy, can y'all hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Alrighty. Well, first off, thanks for giving the lecture. My question was on regarding to like the types of people and like quantities of like white matter and gray matter. So gray matter is composed of a lot more cell bodies, but the white matter is a lot more of the myelinated fibers. So my question would be, in like certain types of people, say people suffering from a certain type of like mental trauma, or say people who just have different like types of manners of navigating the world, say higher functioning people. With people who go about the world differently, would there be different quantities of like gray matter to white matter? Say a highly functioning person, would they have more gray matter as, you know, like more brain cell bodies occurring? Or is it? I'm assuming it's a lot more complex than that, but would there be something that like you could
Yeah,
deduce?
I mean, it is a little bit more complex than that, and it's more to do with the development of these synaptic what we call synaptic density. Now, synaptic density has been correlated with high functioning versus low functioning, and high education, for example, has been correlated with different degrees of synaptic density. There are certain diseases, for example, children children with high functioning children with autism, for example, tend to have smaller, gray matter volumes, in certain regions, and versus, those with Asperger's, for example. And this is when you compare it with children who don't have either. And so there are differences in neurobiology as it relates to gray and white matter that can be influenced by certain conditions. We've seen that in some of these autism spectrum disorders, and it's variable. In some cases, we've seen children with autism having more gray matter in certain areas than non-autistic children, for example, especially in the parietal region. We see an excess amount of gray matter. It's sometimes in autistic children in the parietal area, for example. There are also some other situations where we see reduced gray matter volumes in different the autism spectrum disorders show a whole variety of differences, ranging from increased excess gray matter in certain areas versus less gray matter in other areas, and there have been a lot of within the neurodevelopmental field. There have been a lot of like structural MRI studies that have really tried to analyze gray matter volumes among those who have these types of conditions, including some of your pervasive developmental disorders. So there is definitely some variability in that area, and there's also, as I mentioned, that some data supporting synaptic density in those with, depending on educational status, and just the high functioning that comes with educational status. It's actually one of the reasons why in Alzheimer's disease, you might see in Alzheimer's disease, you might see someone who's very high functioning with Alzheimer's disease that it's really hard to detect clinically because they are so well compensated due to their increase in synaptic density, that they're so well compensated that until some people even think that higher education and higher functionality might actually delay the onset of clinical Alzheimer's disease, and versus those with low educational status and low functioning, where the Alzheimer's disease tends to present at an earlier level. But in terms of the trajectory, once they both have Alzheimer's disease, they go down at the same rate typically. But sometimes high education, high functioning statuses, due to some of these increasing complexity in neuronal synaptic densities, there is some data that supports that these individuals are much more resilient and have delayed onset of certain conditions. And it's due to these types of changes that we're discussing in the brain.
Thank you.
So I can take one more question.
It looks like the person who has been raising their hand the longest is Vithya.
Hi. You mentioned cortical dysplasias, and I was wondering if we know sort of what causes them and if there's any way they can be treated.
Yeah, so I mentioned that cortical we're not that there are that it's really a developmental problem that happens typically before a child is even born. And some people think maybe there are certain things that the mother might have taken during pregnancy, or maybe it might be related to there might be some genetic predisposition, and it's we that there are a variety of potential etiologies that have been suggested, ranging from injury to the mother, to during pregnancy, to some genetic predispositions. And there are three types of cortical dysplasia. There's type 1 that is hard for us to see on the scan, all the way over to type 3, where we can typically see it on these scans. And they tend to be quite focal. It means that they occur in one part of the brain. And so what you find is that it really is a congenital abnormality, and you see the neurons have failed to migrate to their proper location in utero, in the uterus. And so what you see is that you see these areas, these cortical areas, just in strange locations. Because they're in all these strange locations, you can imagine all the disorganization in that area, from a electrical standpoint, and how that area might be hyperactive relative to its surrounding area, and because of the cortical dysplasia, some of these children that have this cortical dysplasia develop epilepsy syndromes. Your second part of the question is how do we treat these cortical dysplasias? Some people refer to them as even cortical scars in the brain, but they are, the technical term is really cortical dysplasia. So how do we treat these type of situations? And really, if patients are having epilepsy from cortical dysplasia, we try to control the epilepsy with medications, but often we do need surgery, and we do need what we call epilepsy surgery, to really take out these, we call them ectopic neurons, these dysplastic, migration failed neurons. We have to really excise them surgically. And that's really the way that we treat a lot of these, especially when they become very troublesome from a quality of life perspective, and they're causing, a lot of seizures is the most common manifestation of these cortical dysplasias. But again, they tend to occur in utero. They're associated with misfiring of the neurons and the incorrect signals that they produce. And we usually have to surgically remove them, or we treat them with medication. And they're actually quite common as a cause of epilepsy in children.
Thank you so much. I think some of the students in the chat had asked if they might be able to contact you potentially via email if they have additional questions that you may not be able to answer during the live session today.
Sure.
Since I think you said earlier that might have been your last question.
Yeah, sure. You can send me an email. I'll be happy to answer.
I think TAs will be around to continue answering questions if anybody else wants to hear from us. Otherwise, we are really grateful that you came to lecture for us today.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So I try to make this talk. You know, I'm a clinical neurologist, and so I try to give you guys real world examples, so that you understand the relationship between neuroanatomy and real world conditions. And so as you continue to learn your neuroanatomy and you learn about the sympathetic nervous system, you understand how you know something like trauma can be explained via some of these mechanisms. As you have family members with either multiple sclerosis or strokes or epilepsy, you understand the functional neuroanatomy behind a lot of these diseases. And as you go into your careers, whether in the neuroscience field or if you go into medical school, this neuroanatomy becomes a real foundation for a lot of the work that we're going to do, either as if we're treating diseases or if we're trying to find cures to these diseases. The real mechanisms behind them and understanding the neuroanatomy and the connections that are spoiled or damaged. We need to understand them before we can figure out how to repair them. And our understanding of a lot of these processes is really what leads to breakthroughs in treatment. And at the end of the day, we're all here to try to make humanity a better place through science. And as far as neuroscience is concerned, neuroanatomy and what your TAs are teaching you and what you're learning through these courses is really going to be critical to going forward. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Unfortunately, I am a practicing physician and I have to see a patient now. But I really enjoyed my time with all of you. Bye-bye.